The search began on a day that started like any other. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the world feels still and at peace, before the weight of an impending tragedy shatters the calm. But for the family of the missing woman, nothing about this day was ordinary. In the town, people spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders with uncertainty, as though the very air had changed. A mother had vanished, leaving only questions in her wake, questions no one had answers to. The weight of it hung in the hearts of everyone who knew her. Her disappearance wasn't the result of a simple misunderstanding, nor was it just another case of someone losing their way. It was a haunting absence, a jarring hole in the fabric of a family's life. She was loved. She was needed. She had a son, young and full life, whose world now stood still, frozen in time. He was left to face a world that no longer made sense. His face, a mixture of confusion and fear, was plastered across every news broadcast, yet no one could understand the torment he felt. To him, the world had stopped turning the moment he realized his mother was gone. The search for her had been extensive. Volunteers, family, and even strangers joined in, eager to help, desperate for closure. There was a collective need to bring her home, to fill the void with something, anything, that would make sense of the pain. In those first few days, the air was filled with a sense of optimism. There were whispers of her being out there somewhere, waiting to be found. People believed they could still rescue her, that the search would lead to a joyful reunion. Everyone clung to that hope. They believed that somewhere, somehow, she would return to her family. It was that glimmer of hope that fueled them forward. But hope, like all fragile things, began to fracture. It was subtle at first, small things that made them question the reality of what was unfolding. A person thought they saw something, but it was a false lead, a scent in the air, an odd noise. But each attempt only served to stretch the uncertainty further. As the days stretched into weeks, the search took on an air of desperation, the shadows of doubt growing longer with every fruitless hour. The optimism began to fade, replaced by something more unnerving. The woman's absence felt more unnatural as time went on. No one had seen her leave, no one knew where she had gone, and no one could make sense of the hole that had formed in her life. It was as though she had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind, no sign of struggle, no answer. The only thing they had were questions. The searchers fanned out in every direction. The town small, familiar streets became unrecognizable under the strain of uncertainty. The paths that once felt safe, that once led to nowhere but home, now felt like avenues to nowhere. Volunteers walked for hours, combing every inch of surrounding woods, scouring every corner of the local park, each step driven by an overwhelming sense of loss. They searched the creeks, the quiet bends of the river. They even searched the abandoned houses on the outskirts of town. Nothing. There were no answers, just empty space and dead ends. The woman was nowhere to be found, but one place, one area, kept drawing them back, where the river met the forest's edge. It was a spot so ordinary it hardly seemed worth noticing, yet somehow it felt like it might hold the key to everything. Locals spoke of the river in hushed tones. It wasn't just a body of water. It was something more, something that felt ancient, a place where time itself seemed to stretch, a place that could either reveal the truth or swallow it whole. The river had always been there, but no one had ever paid it much mind. Now, it seemed like the only place left where something could be found. The water was dark, mysterious, and flowing relentlessly. It whispered, rippled, and crashed with an unsettling presence. The forest around it was dense, the trees arching above like a cathedral of shadows, obscuring what lay beyond. For weeks, the searchers had combed the area, but with every return, it became clearer that something about this river, something about the land around it, resisted the intrusion of the living. It felt as though it was hiding something. The volunteers' faces had grown weary. Their eyes, once hopeful, were now clouded with exhaustion. The urgency they had felt was beginning to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The riverbank, which once seemed like a place full of possibility, had transformed into a symbol of the endless unknown. The absence of answers had begun to consume them, eating away at the spirit of the search. There was only silence now, the quiet murmur of the river that refused to yield to the desperate calls of the family and the volunteers. Among those who were searching was the missing woman's son. His grief, raw and jagged, had taken root deep in his chest, and every day felt like he was suffocating beneath its weight. His mother's disappearance had shattered him, leaving him adrift in a sea of sorrow. He had seen hope in beginning, but now the truth had begun to settle like a stone in his gut. They may never find her. He walked beside the searchers, his footsteps heavier than anyone else's, carrying the burden of loss in ways they couldn't understand. He had known her like no one else. She had been his mother, his protector, the woman who had taught him how to laugh and how to love. Now she was gone, and he was left to piece together the broken fragments of a life that would never be the same. It wasn't just the pain of not knowing that tormented him. It was a gnawing uncertainty. There was nothing to hold on to, no answers, no closure. No one had seen her leave. There were no witnesses, no clues. The world seemed to close in around him with every passing hour. In his mind, he cycled through every possibility. Was she taken? Did she leave on her own accord? Or had something worse happened? But every theory only led to more confusion, more pain. There was no logic to her disappearance. The son had taken upon himself to lead searches, determined to not let his mother's memory be forgotten. He had made a promise to her once, when he was a child, that he would never stop protecting her. That promise had shaped every decision he had made, even as an adult. Now, that promise felt like a weight on his shoulders, because there was nothing he could do to bring her back. All he could do was search, and the river seemed to mock him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden beneath its surface, something that had to do with her disappearance, something buried far deeper than anyone could understand. But no one could predict what would happen next. The river, as relentless and indifferent as it seemed, had one more secret to give. The waters, ever moving, had carried something, a clue. It was there, beneath the dark surface, waiting to be found, waiting to be uncovered. The sun, despite his exhaustion, still clung to the faintest glimmer of hope. His heart, though heavy with sorrow, was driven by a fierce determination. Maybe today, he thought, maybe today we'll find something. And so he pressed on. With every new search, the story continued, inching forward to the fog of mystery, to the pain of uncertainty. With each new clue, the river's secret seemed to grow deeper, more elusive. The search for the missing mother was not just about finding her. It was about finding the answers to questions no one could articulate. It was about piecing together the puzzle of her life, her disappearance, and the terrifying unknown that surrounded it. The search was far from over, and the river, dark and patient, held the key to it all. The search for the missing mother had led them to a place that was as old as the land itself, a place where the earth met the water, where nature's power seemed to hold everything in its grasp. The riverbank was at once hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling. It was a place where the forest and the water shared secrets no one had the courage to ask about. The trees along the river's edge were tall and ancient, their branches heavy with leaves that whispered in the wind. Their roots, twisted and gnarled, snaked down into the dark waters below. It felt as though the very ground was alive with history. Stories long forgotten, lives lost to the river, carried away by its relentless current. Here, in this quiet, seemingly tranquil place, something dangerous lurked beneath the surface. At first, the river had seemed like an afterthought, a peaceful backdrop to the search, a place to comb through in the hopes of finding a trace, an item of clothing, a shoe, a hairpin, something small but telling. Volunteers waded into the muddy water, their hands brushing to the debris, but they found little more than silt and tangled roots. They had searched the forest, the pathways, the roads, but this river, this quiet, murky river, had somehow begun to hold their attention in ways they couldn't explain. It was as though it was calling to them. There was a rhythm to the water, an unrelenting flow that made it impossible to ignore. It was a kind of place where time moved differently, where past and present felt blurred, and the feeling of unease crept in like a thick fog. The more they tried to understand it, the more it slipped away. The searchers gathered at the river's edge with a sense of trepidation that grew each time they returned. The river seemed to mock them, its surface deceptively calm, hiding something darker beneath. The days began to stretch on with no real progress, and with each failed attempt, the air grew thicker. The feeling of urgency that had once filled the search now felt like a shadow, haunting the edges of their determination. Every time they returned, the place seemed to swallow more of their hope, and the searchers felt like they were being pulled deeper into the mystery, deeper into the unknown. Locals, too, had always regarded the river with a strange reverence, never fully able to explain why. There were old stories, tales passed down through generations, that spoke of things that lived in the water, things that were not quite of this world. Some said the river was cursed. Others said it was blessed, but no one truly understood. It was a place where things were lost, memories, lives, and in some cases, the truth itself. The river didn't give up its secrets easily. It was a silent witness to the passage of time, its waters carrying the ghosts of forgotten stories and the whispers of those who had disappeared into its depths. For years, it had held its secrets close, refusing to reveal them to those who sought to understand. As the searchers continued, the river seemed to resist them. It was as if the water itself had a will, a force that made it harder to find what they were looking for. They had tried everything, dragging nets through the water, diving into the cold, murky depths, combing the banks for signs of life, but nothing of any consequence had emerged. The search became an exercise in frustration. The clues they had hoped to find seemed as elusive as the currents themselves. The deeper they searched, the more the river seemed to push back, pulling them into its mystery, refusing to let go. It was on one of these increasingly desperate days that the first real breakthrough came, but it was a discovery so small, so easily overlooked, that it would have been easy to dismiss it entirely. A scrap of cloth, caught in the roots of an ancient tree, that leaned precariously over the water. It was a faded piece of fabric, a color that matched nothing they had seen before, caught on a twisted root just beneath the surface. To anyone else, it might have been a fluke, an insignificant detail, but to the searchers, it was a glimmer of something more, something that had been hidden from view, something the river had kept secret for longer than anyone realized. The cloth seemed to speak of something more, something important, something that had been left behind in the rush of whatever had happened. The sun, weary from days of searching and emotionally drained, stood for a long moment, staring at the piece of fabric. His heart, which had been heavy with doubt, seemed to stir with the faintest spark of hope. It wasn't much. It was just a scrap, but it was something. It was the first sign that the river, that relentless, unforgiving river, might actually be holding on to a piece of the truth. The sun felt it then, the pull of something just beyond his reach, just below the surface, waiting to be found. He bent down, carefully pulling the scrap of fabric from the tangled roots. His hands were shaking as he held it, the realization of what it might mean settling on him like a weight. There was a chance, a fleeting chance, that this small piece of cloth could lead them to the answers they had been searching for. The searchers gathered around him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. The river had given them something, a clue, however small, that could unravel the mystery of his mother's disappearance. The mood shifted. The uncertainty that had clouded their efforts began to break apart, like the first rays of sunlight piercing through a storm. For the first time in days, they felt like they were getting somewhere, like they were on the verge of something. But with that discovery came a feeling, something they couldn't shake, a feeling that the river wasn't just giving up its secrets willingly. There was something about the place, something about the way it had given up that small piece of cloth, that made them wonder if it was trying to communicate with them or if it was simply toying with their emotions. The river was unpredictable, like an animal that could turn at any moment. It gave, then it took away. It was as if it was playing a game, one that no one could quite understand. The searchers were filled with a strange mix of anticipation and fear. They knew they had to press on, but they also knew that the river might not give up what they truly wanted, the full truth. As the days passed, the search intensified. The sun led the charge with a renewed sense of urgency. The small scrap of cloth became the centerpiece of their search. They examined it closely, looking for any identifying marks, any clues that might tie it to his mother. They tried to retrace the woman's last known steps, looking for connections between the fabric and her life. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. They scoured the riverbank, looking for other signs, other hidden pieces that might be waiting to be uncovered. But the river, as always, was silent. It gave nothing more, offering no answers, only more questions. Despite the mystery of the river, the sun pressed forward. He couldn't afford to stop. He couldn't afford to let the mystery consume him entirely. With every step, the river seemed to grow larger, more imposing, like an ancient force that had been there long before him and would remain long after he was gone. It had seen the passage of countless lives, witnessed the flow of time in ways no human could ever comprehend. And yet, as the son waded deeper into the search, he realized something. This wasn't just about finding his mother anymore. It wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about confronting the very forces of nature, forces that were both beautiful and terrifying in their unpredictability. The river had secrets. Secrets it was willing to share, but only in its own time, on its own terms. And as the son stood there, feeling the pull of the water and the weight of the search, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever the river was hiding, he had to uncover it, because the answers were out there, buried beneath the roots, just beneath the surface. The river was waiting for him to find them, and he would not stop until he did. The weight of loss had never been as real to him as it was now. It wasn't just the absence of his mother. It was the silence that had replaced her voice, the void that had replaced her laughter. In the early days, before everything had become so overwhelming, he had believed that finding her would bring closure, would make the silence disappear, would fill the empty spaces with life again. But now, as he stood on the riverbank, watching the water rush past, he realized how naive that hope had been. The silence had settled into him, become part of his bones. It wasn't something he could simply undo with discovery, with a piece of cloth caught in roots or a single clue pulled from the depths. There was something deeper at work here, something far more intangible, and no amount of search would ever bring his mother back in the way he had once imagined. He had promised her, once when he was just a child. He had promised that he would never stop protecting her, that he would always keep her safe. He had spoken those words with the naive conviction of youth, not fully understanding the depth of the responsibility he was taking on. But now, as a grown man, standing in the ruins of that promise, he knew that the weight of those words had been far heavier than he had ever understood. How could he protect her now, when she was gone? How could he fulfill a promise when all the paths he walked only seemed to lead him deeper into the unknown? His eyes drifted across the water again, and his heart twisted. The current was relentless, pulling everything in its path, sweeping away anything that dared to settle too long. His mother, too, had been swept away, and the truth was that he could never bring her back. The search had become more than a quest for answers. It had become a journey of self-discovery, a painful confrontation with the fragility of life. He had been so sure, so confident in the early days that they would find her, but with each passing day, that confidence slipped away like sand through his fingers. He had found the first clue, a scrap of cloth caught in the roots of a tree, and for a brief moment, he had felt hope surge through him, hope that perhaps there was a way to solve this, a way to bring everything back. But now, standing here, surrounded by nothing but the distant rustle of leaves and the slow lapping of the river against the shore, he felt as though that hope was fading, too. What had been a beacon of possibility was now just another piece in a puzzle he didn't understand. And with that realization came another truth. Finding his mother might not be enough. Even if they found her, even if they uncovered every detail of what had happened, would it ever be enough to heal the wound left behind? Could anyone truly fill the space she had once occupied? His mind kept returning to the moments they had shared, the small things that seemed so trivial at the time, but were now the only things that felt real. The sound of her voice calling his name, the warmth of her hand on his forehead when he was sick, the way she smiled when she was proud of him. All those little things, those fleeting moments of connection, were now gone, lost in the same way that she had been lost. He wanted to hold on to them, to keep them close, but they were fading, too, slipping into the distance like fog, until soon they would be nothing but shadows. What was left for him now? What was the point of continuing to search if the end result was simply more loss, more grief? The river seemed to echo that question back to him. It flowed endlessly, its waters dark and unpredictable. It had no answers, no meaning. It just was a force of nature that did not care about the lives it touched. He could stand there for hours, watching the water swirl and shift, but it would never give him what he wanted. The river was just a mirror of the world, chaotic, indifferent, and constantly moving forward, no matter who or what got left behind. For a moment, He thought he could almost feel her presence, like a shadow moving just out of reach. But when he turned, there was nothing but the cold embrace of the current, dragging everything toward the depths. The searchers had noticed a change in him. At first, they had admired his determination, his will to keep going even when the road ahead seemed so dark. But now, they saw a man who was starting to unravel, whose every step seemed weighed down by more than just the exhaustion of searching. He wasn't just searching for his mother anymore. He was searching for something deeper, something he couldn't name, something that could explain why he felt as though he was disappearing along with her. He wasn't the same person who had set out on this journey. The search had become part of him, consuming him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every day, he felt as though he was sinking deeper into the mystery of it all, swallowed up by the need for answers, for closure, for something to make sense of the chaos. It wasn't just the emotional toll that was eating at him. It was the psychological strain of never knowing, never being able to say for sure what had happened. He had spent days piecing together the fragments of his mother's life, trying to make sense of her disappearance. But the more he learned, the more questions arose. Everyone had a theory. The police had their suspicions. The neighbors had their own stories, whispering about things they had seen, things they had heard. But no one had answers. They all just had fragments, bits and pieces of a story that never quite fit together. And the more they searched, the more it seemed like the pieces were slipping further and further away, like a dream fading as soon as you wake up. No one could explain why she had disappeared, and no one could explain why she had left so little behind. It was as though she had vanished into thin air, like smoke dissipating into nothingness. And the more they searched, the more the search began to feel pointless, as if they were chasing something that could never be caught. Every clue felt like a dead end, a false hope, a distraction from the real truth that none of them could understand. They had found a scrap of cloth. But what did it mean? It could have been anything. Something she had worn, something she had discarded, something that had no real significance at all. The river had given them that small piece of evidence, but it had given them nothing else. The cloth was just another reminder that there were no answers, no closure, only the ever-present, ever-flowing water, which carried away everything in its path, leaving nothing but the echoes of what once was. It was this realization that haunted him the most, that the search might never end, that he might spend the rest of his life chasing something that could never be caught. He wasn't just searching for his mother. He was searching for peace, for understanding, for a way to make the pain go away. But no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many steps he took, it felt as though the truth was always just beyond his grasp, floating in the water like a mirage. Every day, he fought the urge to give up, to stop searching, to walk away from the relentless weight of the mystery. But he couldn't. He couldn't because the promise he had made to her still echoed in his mind, louder than any doubt, louder than the exhaustion that gripped him. He had promised her that he would always protect her, that he would never stop searching for the truth, even if it meant losing himself along the way. And so, with each new day, the search continued. The sun pressed on, not because he knew he would find the answers, but because he couldn't stop. The journey had become part of who he was now, a part of his identity. Every step was a step into the unknown, a step into the heart of the mystery, into the depths of his grief. But he was not alone. Others were searching too, and the pain they shared, the uncertainty they faced, was a bond that kept them moving forward. Together, they would keep searching. Together, they would keep hoping. Even if it felt like the river had taken everything, even if it felt like the answers would never come, they had no choice but to keep going, because in the end, it wasn't about finding her. It was about finding themselves in the search. The weeks had passed in a blur of faces, of searching, of uncertainty, and of slowly fading hope. What had once felt like a mission driven by urgency and love had turned into an exercise in sheer endurance. Every day, the same path, the same riverbank, the same fruitless hours spent combing through mud and leaves, eyes scanning the ground for anything at all that might bring some kind of clarity. The volunteers and searchers who had started with a kind of wide-eyed optimism, believing that they could make a difference, believing that they could find answers, had begun to show signs of fatigue. Their faces, once bright with purpose, now looked drawn and weary. They spoke in lower tones, as if afraid to disturb the heavy silence that seemed to hang over them. It was as though they, too, were beginning to lose a conviction that they would ever uncover the truth. The river had become not just a place of mystery, but a symbol of frustration, of things left unsaid, of secrets buried too deep to be uncovered. But it wasn't just the volunteers who were feeling the weight of the search. The sun, more than anyone, had begun to bear the burden of this mission with a heaviness that he could no longer carry alone. His mind had become consumed by thoughts of his mother. His heart forever tugged in two directions. One pulled by the hope that maybe, just maybe, she would be found, and the other by the crushing realization that the search might never yield anything concrete. The optimism he had clung to so fiercely in the beginning had been slowly eroded by days spent with no significant leads, no discoveries that could answer the questions that tormented him. His body ached from the endless hours of searching, but it was his soul, his spirit, that felt the weight the most. Every morning, he rose with a quiet determination, though it had begun to feel more like a duty than anything resembling hope. He had learned to suppress the quiet voice inside him that whispered it was time to stop, that he would never find her, that he had already lost more than he was willing to admit. The idea of stopping, of walking away from the river and leaving the search behind, seemed almost impossible. He had made a promise to her, a promise to never stop searching, to always keep looking until the truth was uncovered. But with every passing day, he had begun to wonder whether that promise was even possible to fulfill. Was it possible to truly keep a promise to someone who was no longer there? Was it even possible to keep searching for something that might not exist? He found himself questioning his motivations. Was he searching for answers, or was he simply trying to outrun the grief that had settled deep within him? He had spent so long clinging to the idea of closure, of an end to the pain, that he had never stopped to ask whether finding his mother's body or uncovering the truth would really bring peace. And even now, as his search dragged on with no new revelations, he began to realize that finding the answers might not ease the ache in his chest. The river, with its elusive nature, seemed to reflect his inner turmoil, its dark waters always hiding something just out of reach, as though mocking his every attempt to understand. The volunteers were starting to scatter. Those who had remained loyal to the cause, whose hearts were still tied to the mission, were beginning to pull away. The search had dragged on longer than anyone had expected, and the toll it was taking on people's spirits was becoming too much to bear. As much as they wanted to help, as much as they wanted to be the ones to solve the mystery, their own lives were calling them back. They had families, jobs, responsibilities that they could no longer ignore. The son understood, of course. He wasn't angry with them. They had all given what they could, had poured their energy and hope into something that might never yield results. But still, there was a part of him that resented their departure. It felt like one more abandonment, one more person walking away from the search for his mother, leaving him alone in the middle of it all. He couldn't escape the feeling that with each person who left, another thread of hope unraveled. The son tried to keep going, tried to hold on to that last shred of belief that they could find something, that something, anything, was out there waiting to be discovered. But the more they searched, the more it felt like the land itself was pushing back against them, unwilling to yield. The river seemed to mock their efforts. The water flowed relentlessly, as if time itself were simply moving forward, indifferent to the lives that had been caught in its current. The trees, too, had begun to feel like silent witnesses, their branches reaching out to the sky, casting long, unsettling shadows across the ground. Everything in the landscape seemed to be pulling away from them, closing in on itself, hiding the answers they desperately sought. It was around this time that something began to change within the son. A sense of deep, gnawing frustration started to take root. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed that effort could produce results, that if you worked hard enough, you could make things happen. But now, standing on the riverbank, watching the current move steadily onward, he realized that there were forces far greater than him at play here. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how many hours he spent digging into the earth or combing through the trees, the river remained implacable, as if it had no intention of giving up its secrets. The search had begun to feel like an act of futility. The more they dug, the more they uncovered, the less they seemed to understand. Every clue they found, whether it was a scrap of clothing, an abandoned object, a trail of disturbed earth, felt like a small piece in a puzzle that didn't make sense. There were no clear answers, no neat explanations. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to make sure this mystery would never be solved, that the river and the forest will hold on to the truth forever, keeping it hidden from the world. The son's mind spun in circles, trying to piece together the fragments of his mother's life, trying to understand why she had disappeared, why she had left them all behind. But the more he searched, the more it seemed like the truth was out of reach, like something that could never be understood. At night, when he returned home exhausted from the day's search, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. What was it all for? He had given everything to this search, had poured his soul into finding her, into solving the mystery. But was it worth it? Would he find peace if he knew what had happened to his mother? Or would it only create more pain? He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they were searching for weren't as simple as they had once believed. Maybe there was something darker at play here. Maybe the truth was more complicated, more painful than anyone could comprehend. And so the search continued. The son pushed forward, though his steps felt heavier now, as though he was walking not just through the forest, not just along the riverbank, but through the very heart of his grief. It was no longer just about finding his mother. It was about finding something deeper, something that could make sense of everything he had lost. But the river, as always, was indifferent. It flowed on, carried with the weight of untold stories, of truths that would never be fully revealed. And in the silence of the woods, in the stillness of the search, the son found himself facing a terrifying truth. Some things, some mysteries, would never be solved. There was a strange and unsettling stillness that had settled over the search in the weeks after the exhaustion began to take its toll. What had started as a frantic rush, filled with purpose and optimism, had slowly turned into something else entirely. The searchers were now driven more by a sense of obligation than the hope they once clung to. They were aware of how fragile the thin thread of hope had become, and yet they continued, dragging themselves through the days with heavy hearts, knowing that the chance of finding the woman alive, of finding any answers, was slipping further and further away. There were no more volunteers showing up in the numbers they once did. The faces had become familiar, worn with fatigue, their eyes carrying the weight of uncertainty and sorrow. The missing woman's son, though physically present, had started to seem as though he were drifting away from the reality of the search itself. His mind was consumed with what could be, what might be, but not with what was happening around him. The discovery, once a distant hope, now felt like it was as far from their grasp as it had ever been. Yet, despite the growing despair, there came a small shift, a spark of something that would pull them all forward once again. It wasn't much, not in the way of groundbreaking evidence or clear signs, but it was enough to reignite the faintest glimmer of possibility in their hearts. It began with a simple observation, almost an afterthought, from one of the searchers who had been working in a different part of the riverbank, a piece of the landscape that had been overlooked. As the search had grown repetitive, many had started to pay less attention to the small, seemingly insignificant details. But this particular volunteer, their gaze naturally drawn to a different part of the riverbank, saw something caught in the roots of a tree. It was so faint, so hidden, that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. The cloth, a piece of fabric, was tangled in the deep crevices of the roots, blending almost seamlessly with the surroundings. It was faded, worn, but there was something about it that seemed wrong. Something about the way it caught the light. There was no immediate connection between this cloth and the woman they were searching for, but it didn't matter. There was a sense that something was finally different. This wasn't just debris washed ashore. This was something that had purpose. The son, who had been tirelessly combing the area with less and less motivation each day, was called over. When he saw it, he stood still for a moment, as though waiting for his mind to catch up with the realization. His heart began to race. Could this be it? Could this small scrap of fabric lead into answers? He hesitated, his fingers brushing over the torn edges, feeling the weight of the moment. It was strange how something so seemingly insignificant could suddenly hold so much meaning. His breath caught in his throat. The searchers gathered around him, feeling the shift in the air, their hope rising ever so slightly. There was an energy to the moment, a flicker of life in the ashes of their doubts. For just a brief second, it seemed like the river was offering them something, anything to cling to. They carefully examined the piece of fabric. It wasn't much, a faded piece of cloth caught in the knotted roots of an old tree, but it was enough to reignite a sense of urgency in their hearts. They turned it over in their hands, inspecting it for any marks, any clues that could link it to the missing mother. There was a faint smell of dirt, a musty scent of decay, but there was something else, something far more chilling that lingered in the air. It was a weight of uncertainty, the knowledge that they could be at the brink of something that would either bring them closer to truth or send them down a darker, more complex path. The discovery was small, almost inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but to the son, it felt like a lifeline. He stared at the cloth, his hands trembling ever so slightly. It was just a piece of fabric, but it could hold the key to everything. He could feel the pulse of his mother's presence, lingering in the air like a whisper. Was this a sign? Was this the breakthrough he had been waiting for? His thoughts raced. He had been prepared for this moment, in some way. He had prepared himself for the possibility of finding his mother. But this was different. It wasn't a body. It wasn't a clear answer. It was a symbol, a thread that had been pulled from the tapestry of her disappearance. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing. They couldn't stop now. The river was still holding on to its secrets, but it had given them something to follow. It had offered them a piece of the puzzle, and that piece was worth everything. They carefully carried the fabric to the nearby camp, where others were waiting. There was a quiet tension in the air. As they walked, they didn't speak much. Everyone was too consumed by the realization that this was something significant. The son's heart pounded in his chest, and with each step, he felt the weight of the search lift just slightly. The feeling was fleeting, but it was there, enough to make him believe that they might still be able to make sense of it all. As the team examined the fabric under better light, they tried to find any indication of where it might have come from, who it might belong to, or whether it was related to the woman's disappearance. It was rough, its edges frayed and tattered, showing signs of wear and tear. But it didn't match anything in the woman's wardrobe that they could recall. There were no obvious distinguishing marks. Still, the mystery of it lingered. The more they discussed the fabric, the more they realized it didn't provide the answers they had hoped for, but it led them to something they hadn't anticipated, a renewed sense of purpose. In some ways, the uncertainty of the fabric's origin only made the search feel more urgent. It wasn't a direct link to the missing woman, but it felt connected. The searchers began to turn their focus back to the water's edge, re-examining the land with fresh eyes. The fabric had opened the door to new possibilities. Perhaps they had been looking in the wrong places before. Perhaps they had missed something essential. The clues, however scattered they were, might be closer than they had realized. The river's power over the landscape and over their search had always been undeniable, but now, for the first time, it felt like the river was leading them somewhere. It wasn't clear yet, not by any means, but they were beginning to see it. There was something in the way the land had shifted, something in the way the water seemed to carry the fabric to its resting place. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, an invitation to dig deeper, to search with more intensity, to uncover the truths that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long. They returned to the riverbank, the sun now at the forefront of the search once more. There was a different energy in his steps now, a quiet but insistent belief that they might finally be close. The piece of fabric had given him something to hold on to, a thread in the dark, a glimmer of something real. The search became less about the physical act of looking and more about following the clues the land had left behind. The river, which had been a symbol of helplessness, now felt like a guide, leading them towards something, toward the answer they had all been seeking. The sense of mystery still hung in the air like a thick fog, but was no longer suffocating. It had become something more, something to chase, something to unravel. And so they pressed on, no longer weighed down by the silence that had plagued them for so long. The fabric, though small and insignificant, had broken the stillness. It had ignited something that had been missing for weeks, a sense of possibility. Even if they didn't know where the river would take them, they knew now that they couldn't afford to stop searching, not when they were so close to finding the answers. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, they could see a way forward, no longer driven by blind hope, but by a growing certainty that the river, in all its mystery, held the truth. It was just waiting to be uncovered. As the search for his mother continued to stretch on, A quiet unease began to settle over the son. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when he caught himself wondering if they had already missed something crucial, if the truth had always been just out of reach, taunting them with its elusive nature. The riverbank had given up a scrap of cloth, and that discovery, small as it seemed, had reignited their determination. But in the stillness that followed, as days bled into weeks, the search felt like an exhausting cycle of false hope and fading possibilities. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he was certain it wasn't this. This endless uncertainty, this gnawing feeling that maybe the answers he sought were buried too deep to find, too far removed from the present to ever be truly understood. He often found himself standing at the edge of the river, staring into its dark, roiling depths as if searching for something in its currents. The water had an ancient, mysterious quality to it, as though it carried the weight of centuries of stories, secrets, and lives long lost to its embrace. The sound of the water rushing over rocks and branches had become a constant companion, a constant reminder that the search was ongoing, relentless, and yet still so inconclusive. The river seemed to move with purpose, as if it knew something he didn't, a knowledge that was buried too deep within its waters for any human to fully grasp. Days would stretch into one another, indistinguishable in their quiet passage, each day a repetition of the last. He would arrive at the riverbank early in the morning, heart heavy with anticipation, only to leave hours later with nothing but the heavy burden of his own thoughts. The search had become a ritual, one that seemed to blur the line between action and stagnation. The volunteers had started to thin out, leaving behind only the most committed, those whose own losses and grief made it impossible for them to walk away. There was a shared understanding among those who remained, the sense that they were all chasing the same elusive truth, that they were bound together by a collective sense of duty, even if they weren't sure what that duty was anymore. The son's relationship with the search had changed in subtle but profound ways. What had once been a desperate attempt to find his mother, to bring her home, had now become something else. It was no longer just about locating her, about piecing together the fragments of her disappearance. The search had become a search for meaning, for understanding, for a way to make sense of the pain that had woven itself into the fabric of his life. He realized now that the quest for answers was, in some ways, a journey into his own grief, a confrontation with his inability to control or fix the chaos that had unfolded around him. He had thought, in the beginning, that if he could just find her, everything would fall back into place. But the more he searched, the more he understood that the search itself, this relentless pursuit of truth that seemed to be slipping further away, was a reflection of the grief that had settled into him like a shadow. It was as though the mystery of his mother's disappearance had opened a door into a place he didn't want to go, a place where everything felt fractured, where the sense of loss became more complex with each passing day. He wasn't sure if finding her would heal the wound in his heart or if it would only serve to open it wider, to expose the rawness that had been festering beneath the surface. And yet, even as the doubts began to crowd his mind, the son couldn't bring himself to stop. He couldn't walk away from the search, even when it seemed hopeless, even when the river mocked him with its relentless current, carrying the answers just out of reach. The small discovery, the piece of cloth tangled in the roots, had pushed him to keep going. It had given him a brief moment of hope, a fleeting sensation that maybe, just maybe, the river had finally given him something to hold on to. But with each passing day, that hope began to feel more fragile, as if it could slip away as easily as the cloth had been carried downstream. The fabric, though significant, wasn't enough to reveal the truth. It wasn't enough to tell him where his mother had gone, what had happened to her, why she had disappeared. There were still too many questions, too many blanks to fill in. The more they searched, the more they found themselves chasing after shadows, their hands grasping at things that didn't seem to matter, things that only brought them further into the darkness. The volunteer group, once so enthusiastic and full of energy, had begun to show signs of the same weariness that gripped the son. The days were growing longer, and the weight of the search was becoming heavier. They, too, had started to wonder if they would ever find what they were looking for. The feeling of defeat was subtle, a quiet shift in the atmosphere, but it was undeniable. There was no more optimism, no more excitement about the possibility of discovery. Instead, there was a quiet resignation that had taken root among them, as if they were all simply going through the motions, pretending that they still had hope when in reality, they didn't know where else to turn. Yet despite this, there remained a small but persistent thread of determination, particularly in the son. Every time he stood at the edge of the river, watching the water churn and flow, he was reminded that there was still something to be found, that there was still a reason to keep searching. It wasn't just for his mother anymore. It was for something deeper, something that lay beneath the surface of the mystery itself. It was as though the river, with its endless flow, was calling to him, challenging him to understand it, to unlock its secrets. And even though he had no clear idea of how he would do that, he couldn't shake the feeling that the river was trying to tell him something, if only he could listen long enough to hear it. The more the son thought about it, the more he began to see the parallels between the river and the journey he had been on. The water, unrelenting and unpredictable, seemed to mirror the chaos of his own life. The twists and turns of the current, the way it pulled everything in its path, was like the way grief had swept him away, forcing him to follow its path even when he didn't understand it. The river didn't ask for permission. It just flowed. It didn't care who was caught in its current. It simply moved forward, regardless of the destruction it left behind. The search for his mother had felt like that at times, an uncontrollable force that swept him up in its wake, dragging him further and further from the life he had known, pushing him into the unknown until he didn't know who he was anymore. In those moments, standing at the edge of the river, the son felt a strange mixture of powerlessness and resolve. He knew that the river, for all its beauty, for all its mystery, was not something he could control. It was not something anyone could tame. It was a force of nature like grief, like time itself, unpredictable and unstoppable. But what the river had taught him, in its own quiet way, was that sometimes the answers weren't meant to be found immediately. Sometimes they had to be allowed to emerge on their own when the time was right, when the pieces finally fell into place. And so the son pressed on, not because he knew the river would give up its secrets, but because he couldn't stop searching. Even in the face of doubt, even in the face of exhaustion, he kept returning to the water's edge, hoping that one day it would give him what he needed to understand. The river had already taken so much from him, his mother, his peace, his sense of certainty, but it had also given him something valuable, the strength to keep moving forward. The search, in the end, wasn't about finding the answers. It was about what happened along the way, what the journey revealed about who he was, and what he was willing to endure. There were days when he doubted, when he wondered if it was all for nothing. But in the quiet moments, in the stillness that sometimes filled the spaces between their frantic searches, he knew that he couldn't walk away. The river was still there, flowing, waiting, and he was still searching. No matter how many pieces of fabric or broken clues they found, no matter how many unanswered questions lingered in the air, the river would not give up its secrets easily. But the son, like the river itself, was not going to stop. He had come this far. And in the end, that might be all that mattered. The days were beginning to blur into one another now, indistinguishable from the last, with no clear end in sight. What had once been a mission filled with hope, urgency, and purpose now felt like a long, winding road that stretched endlessly in front of them, with no landmarks to signify progress. The river, which had once seemed like a guide, an ever-present companion, had become something of an adversary. It moved relentlessly, carrying with it the debris of life, the remnants of what had been, but offering nothing more than uncertainty. The search had become a battle between the longing for answers and the overwhelming fear that those answers would never come. The son had become almost numb to the passage of time, to the rhythms of the search, the repetition of it all. Each day began with the same sense of hope, the same belief that today might be the day, and ended in the quiet realization that they had uncovered nothing, that they were no closer to understanding what had happened to his mother. And yet, even as the weight of those unfulfilled days pressed down on him, he could not bring himself to stop. To stop meant to accept the possibility that she was truly lost, that he would never find her, never understand what had happened to her. And the thought of that was unbearable. Even now, as he stood once again at the edge of the river, watching the water swirl and churn in the dimming light of the evening, there was a flicker of something deep within him, a quiet, unspoken belief that the truth was out there, hidden just beneath the surface. He couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it with logic or reason, but there was something about the river, about the way it moved, that seemed to whisper to him, urging him to keep going. It was as if the river itself knew the answers, knew what happened to his mother, but was keeping it locked away, only to reveal it when the time was right. The water carried secrets, stories from the past, from people long gone, and he had come to realize, with a deep, painful clarity, that this river was no different. It held something. He could feel it in his bones, even if he couldn't see it with his eyes. It was a truth wrapped in layers of history, a story that was waiting to be uncovered, a riddle that needed to be solved. The volunteers had dwindled to a handful, and the ones who remained were weary, as exhausted emotionally as they were physically. There was a weariness in the air, a tiredness that seemed to have seeped into the very ground they walked on. The search had become less about finding his mother and more about the endurance of the human spirit, about the determination to keep going even when every instinct screamed to give up. They had been searching for so long, and there had been so little to show for it. The sun could see it in their faces. Those who had once come with wide-eyed hope, now carrying the burden of that hope with heavy hearts. But even they, despite their fatigue, hadn't given up. They, too, were still here, still pushing forward, still searching for something, anything, that could bring them closer to the truth. It was hard not to feel as though the land itself was conspiring against them. The search had taken them through every inch of the riverbank, through every wooded area, every clearing, and every hill that bordered the water's edge. The earth had been combed over again and again, and yet there were no answers, no breakthroughs. Every footprint, every sign, every scrap of evidence seemed to lead them in circles, taking them further into a maze with no clear exit. The land had given up its secrets, but only in fragments, half-truths, whispers of something that could never quite be grasped. The more they dug, the more the landscape seemed to shift, as if it were actively hiding the answers, as though the earth itself was pushing them back, forcing them to reconsider their approach. And then there were the moments of silence, the quiet stretches of time when nothing happened, the times when the river seemed to stand still, when the wind had no voice, when even the trees seemed to hold their breath. These moments were the hardest. They stretched on forever, filling the air with a sense of suffocating emptiness. It was in these moments that doubt crept in, slowly at first, a whisper in the back of his mind, and then louder, more insistent. What if they never found anything? What if the truth had already slipped away, lost the time, lost the river, lost the world? What if his mother was truly gone, and there was nothing more to discover? What if there was no answer, no explanation, no reason at all? The son would lie awake at night, staring into the darkness, his thoughts consumed by these questions. The quiet of the night was sometimes more suffocating than the silence of the riverbank, the weight of his own uncertainty pressing on him, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he wondered if it might be easier to stop, to accept that some mysteries were too vast to solve, that some losses were too great to ever make sense of. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he pushed it away. To stop meant to give up. To stop meant to accept defeat. And he couldn't do that. He couldn't walk away from her. Not when it was still the faintest glimmer of hope. Not when the truth still lay just beyond his reach. In the days that followed, something began to shift within him. It was subtle at first, like a soft breeze stirring the leaves in the trees, but it grew stronger with each passing day. The son began to realize that the search for his mother, though important, had become something far more complicated. It was no longer just about finding her. It was about confronting the unknown, about facing the rawness of life and death, of grief and loss. It was about acknowledging that sometimes answers were elusive, that closure was not always possible, and that some things were meant to remain mysteries, buried in the past, hidden from the light of day. This realization didn't make the pain of the search any easier to bear. It didn't lessen the ache in his chest, the longing he still felt for his mother, for the woman who had given him life and love, who had shaped the very person he had become. But it gave him a new perspective. It made him understand that the search was not just about finding answers, but about coming to terms with the uncertainty, the things that could never be understood, the things that were always out of reach. There was a beauty in the search itself, a quiet strength in the journey, even if the destination was uncertain. It wasn't just a river that had secrets. It was life itself. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would make sense, that every question would have an answer. Sometimes, the only thing left to do was to keep moving forward, to keep searching, even when the way was unclear, even when the answers were elusive. It was in the act of searching that meaning was found. It was in the effort, in the persistence, that the son realized the true nature of his quest. It wasn't about solving the mystery of his mother's disappearance. It was about finding his way through the darkness, about discovering the strength to keep going even when the road was long and uncertain. As the search dragged on, the son began to notice something he hadn't before. There was a strange kind of solidarity in the silence. The volunteers, though they had become few in number, shared in the weight of the journey. They, too, had come to understand that the search was not just about finding answers. It was about the shared experience of searching, of hoping, of standing together in the face of the unknown. There was a bond that had formed among them, a quiet, unspoken understanding that they were all in this together, that no one had to face the uncertainty alone. The more he thought about it, the more the son realized that the river, with all its power and mystery, was not just a symbol of loss. It was a symbol of life itself, of the constant flow of time, of the way everything moved and changed and slipped away, leaving only memories behind. It was a reminder that the world didn't wait for anyone, that life didn't pause for grief, that the search itself, the act of moving forward, was what mattered most. And so, with renewed determination, the son pressed on. He continued to walk along the riverbank, each step a quiet act of defiance against the uncertainty that had taken root in his heart. The search had become more than just a search for answers. It had become a search for himself, for the strength to keep going, even when the answers seemed just out of reach. The river, with its endless flow, would continue to carry its secrets. But the son, like the river, would keep moving forward. He had no choice. The journey had become his own. The search, relentless and unyielding, had now entered its final phase. The days had stretched into months, and the hours seemed to bleed into one another, each one indistinguishable from the last. But as the weeks wore on, there was a subtle shift in the air, something that no one could quite put their finger on, but something that was undeniably there. The searchers, those who remained, had grown quieter, their voices softer, their steps slower. The once vibrant energy that had filled the riverbank in the early days of the hunt had faded, replaced by an exhaustion that seemed to seep into the very soil beneath their feet. Hope, like the sun sinking below the horizon, was waning, but it still lingered, a faint glow that refused to be snuffed out entirely. There was something about the river, something about the land itself, that kept them tethered, even when the answers seemed beyond their reach. For the son, the journey had become a personal one, even more than it had ever been before. He had started this search with the goal of finding his mother, of unraveling the mystery that had consumed his life. But now, as the search dragged on, he found himself grappling with something deeper, something more profound. The river, which had once symbolized a path to answers, now felt like a mirror to his own grief. It was as though every step he took along the riverbank brought him closer to some understanding, some deeper truth about the pain that had taken root in his heart. It was a search for his mother, yes, but it had also become a search for something he had not anticipated, a confrontation with his own fears, his own unresolved feelings of loss, an inevitable passage of time. He would walk along the water's edge, staring into its dark depths, lost in thought. The sound of the water crashing over rocks and splashing against the shore had become a constant companion, a reminder that life, like the river, moved forward whether he was ready or not. It had been so long since he had seen his mother, since she had disappeared without a trace, and yet it felt as if she was still there, somewhere in the world, just beyond his grasp. Every night, he would lie awake, replaying the events in his mind, try to make sense of them, try to understand what happened, try and understand why. But no matter how many times he went over the details, there were still so many unanswered questions. The mystery remained just out of reach, like a puzzle with a piece missing, like a story that had been left unfinished. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when he would feel her presence, as though she were right there beside him, guiding him, reminding him not to give up. It wasn't something he could explain, but it was real nonetheless. Sometimes, in the quiet of the riverbank, in the moments when the world seemed to fall away, he could almost hear her voice, soft and comforting, urging him to keep going, to hold on to the hope that the truth would eventually surface. But those moments were fleeting, like the wind, here one moment and gone the next. The rest of the time, he was left alone with his thoughts, with the endless questions that had no answers, with the grief that had begun to feel like a permanent part of his existence. The volunteers, those who had stayed with him through the long months of searching, were just as weary as he was. They had come together in the early days with a shared sense of purpose, a belief that they could make a difference, that they could bring answers to a family in need. But now, as the search stretched on with no sign of the missing woman, the resolve of the group had begun to waver. They had scoured every inch of the riverbank, searched every tree, every rock, every shadow, and still nothing. It was as if the earth itself was swallowing the truth, holding it close, refusing to let go. The land had become an unwilling participant in the tragedy, a witness to the pain but not a source of answers. Despite the exhaustion, despite the creeping doubt that had settled over them like a heavy fog, the son could feel that something was shifting. The search was no longer about finding his mother alone. It had become something larger, something more intricate and layered. The river had become a reflection of his own inner turmoil, its currents carrying him through unknown waters, each turn and bend bringing him closer to something he could not yet comprehend. There was a part of him that had come to understand, on some level, that finding his mother, or even understanding what had happened to her, might not be the kind of closure he had imagined. The river would not give up its secrets easily, but perhaps that was part of the lesson. There were some things that could never be understood, some mysteries that were too vast to be solved. Yet, even with that realization, the pull of the search remained strong. It was as though the act of searching had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his life, something that could not be abandoned, even in the face of uncertainty. The search had become a journey, not just through the physical landscape, but through his own heart. He could no longer separate the two. The river was no longer just a river, and the search was no longer just an external quest. It was all intertwined, all connected in ways he couldn't explain. The landscape was alive with memories, with echoes of his mother's laughter, of the times they had shared together. The trees, the rocks, the water, they all seemed to hold pieces of her, fragments of life that had once been whole but was now fractured, scattered across time and space. As the weeks turned into months, the emotional toll began to weigh heavier on everyone. The volunteers who remained felt the exhaustion of the search pressing down on them, their bodies and minds stretched to their limits. It wasn't just a physical labor, the long days spent combing the land and searching for any shred of evidence. It was an emotional weight, the constant uncertainty, the lingering question of whether they would ever find what they were looking for. They had given so much of themselves, had poured their hearts into this mission, and yet, with every passing day, the answer seemed to slip further away. And then, just when the fatigue seemed unbearable, a shift came. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden breakthrough, but it was something that none of them could ignore. It started with a feeling, a strange sensation that seemed to pulse in the air, something in the rhythm of the water, something in the way the wind whispered through the trees. The son felt it first, as he stood once again at the edge of the river, staring into the depths, waiting, hoping. He didn't know what it was. There was no clear explanation for it, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. It was as if the river had shifted, as if the earth had moved beneath him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring inside him, a deep, unspoken knowledge that something was about to change. He didn't know what that change would look like, or if it would even be the kind of change he had hoped for. But in that moment, he knew that the search was not over. There was still something left to discover, something hidden just beneath the surface. The river, for all its secrets, was not done. It had more to give, more to reveal. The son took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the answers were still out there, somewhere, waiting for them. He didn't know how or when they would come, but he knew that the search had not been in vain. The river was still speaking, still holding on to the truth. All they had to do was keep listening, keep moving forward, and eventually the answers would surface. And so, despite the weariness, despite the doubts, despite the long months of searching with no tangible results, the son continued on. The river had not given up its secrets, but neither had he. There was still hope, faint as it was, and that was enough to keep him going. The journey was not over.